Anti-Semitism is blood libel and conspiracy, firstly. Secondly, some of you might have heard of the Livingston formulation, and I will talk a little about that. I'm interested in looking at the relationship between the real world and an anti-Semitic understanding of the world, because the two are not completely separate, but they are separate. Quite interested in looking at agency, because we have lots of theories of anti-Semitism, which is kind of ahistorical and all over the place, and I'm quite interested in asking the question about who is responsible for an anti-Semitism which everybody denies and which the people who are embracing it do not recognize. A word about left anti-Semitism, that there is an authentic left-wing tradition of anti-Semitism, and it can't just be written off as a kind of right-wing attack. A word on dog whistles and deliberate ambiguity. Hello. And then a word on the... You're very welcome. Thank you for telling us. A word on... What the fuck? No. Everybody, this is Charles Small. He's a veteran of the anti-apartheid movement, of Goldsmiths College, of the peace movement, of... I'll stop there, because to save his blushes.
Here it is. So, did you introduce yourself? Anyway.
I'm the man who needs no introduction. All right.
Okay.
Done.
So the way it's going to work, okay, sorry I came late, I was doing the whole thing. Pardon?
Is the mic on? No. Mic for the camera.
So David's going to speak for 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have the ability to have a conversation, a debate. So David Hirsh. He's the he's the founder of the founder of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. He's a scholar for many years, teaching at Goldsmiths College at the University of London. Today he's going to speak about the rebirth of anti-Semitism in the 21st century. David has been fighting anti-Semitism on the battlefield of ideas for a long time, for nearly 20 odd years. And we first met when he started taking on the Teachers Union in the UK, and came as our first research scholar, visiting professor at Yale University when we started YISA, which was, we created ISGAP, and ISGAP created the center at Yale, and David was our first scholar there, and he's published widely. He has all sorts of books that he'll reference, and we're honored that you're here again, David.
Thanks, Charles.
Welcome. Now you can start.
Okay, so there's my agenda. Then what is new about 7th of October? I think that's actually a really interesting question, and one that we could spend the whole time on. And then a little bit about our work, about the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, about our book publishing project, and about our conference, of which we have published a call for papers for next end of March, beginning of April. So begin with, what is anti-Semitism? Where does it come from? And anti-Semitism comes from two traditions, really, and the first is blood libel. The first is an understanding from some Christian traditions, especially some early Christian traditions, really a puzzlement, right? God has sent his son to save us and to suffer for us, and the Jews don't recognize it. What stubbornness, what evil, and then there are myths about God murdering. And in particular, that becomes a myth of the idea that Jews did not only make themselves suffer by not loving Christ, but they also make everybody suffer. So the Jewish crime is not just against the Jew, but the Jewish crime is a block between all of us and progress, or all of us and utopia. And I think that is an idea that comes from some early Christian traditions. So blood libel, that the Jews murdered God, not for any gain, just for out of pure evil. And the second is Jewish power, is conspiracy, is the world is frightening and it's scary and it doesn't seem fair and it looks like some people have got everything sewn up, and it's very easy to understand that in terms of a hidden conspiracy which hides behind the observable, complex, difficult reality. And the interesting thing about conspiracy fantasy is that it is always open to becoming anti-Semitic. Why? Because the Christian image of the Jew as a kind of symbolic of evil, not really quite human, with claws and horns and a big ugly face, that image became a symbol of evil. And if you're embracing a view of the world that says there are evil people behind the scenes making the things that you can see unjust and all wrong while pretending that they're all right, there's a temptation to give it a human face, to give those forces that screw everything up for all of us, to give it a human face. And I think of it as a kind of evolutionary process, that anti-Semitism has evolved through a whole number of different times in history and places and forms, but each time it evolves the image of the Jew which is useful for symbolizing evil. And that's conspiracy fantasy, I think. So blood libel goes back, you know, the histories about the reenactment of the crucifixion on the body of non-Jewish children, often related to lust for blood and bloodletting and blood consumption. Maybe I should have given you a trigger warning for that. That is one of the most upsetting images I've ever seen, actually, of blood libel. And notice, by the way, that the fork that holds the non-Jewish victim... Oh, sorry. Oh, that's a real tease then, wasn't it? Sorry. I've got two different things going on here. Blood libel. And that is the image I'm talking about, which I have now given you a trigger warning for. Notice the fork that holds the victim in place for the Jew is an American fork. So the United States of America becomes a tool of evil in the hands of the Jewish entity. So all of the elements are there: non-Jewish child being consumed, having their blood drunk, and looking very lovely and innocent, and
the silence of the Arabs. Yeah. Maybe the knife that's cutting the child says, the silence of the Arabs.
So the two forces responsible, one is America and the other is the complicity through silence of the Arab people in the Arab states. I don't know. It's easy to find, actually, if you do the search. There's another one which is from 2006, the Lebanon War, which is also a pure image of child murder. Oh, fuck. All right, I'm putting that away, and I'm just going to look at the screen behind me. That is a classic image of child murder from 2006, from the Lebanon War. Interestingly, that is an image created by Latoufe, and Latoufe is a Brazilian cartoonist who won the third prize in President Ahmadinejad's Holocaust denial cartoon competition in, anyone remember the date?
2006.
Tehran, yes, 2006.
The Holocaust denial.
And Latif is interesting because Latif crosses over between Ahmadinejad, who is an explicit anti-Semite, and he's also loved and embraced by people who do not at all think that they are anti-Semitic. So it's an interesting crossover motif. So on to conspiracy. So these are the key elements of anti-Semitism. This is a very nice quote, passage from Anthony Julius, actually, which I didn't want to mess about with, so I will read it. The question is now posed: are Jews liars? And I think quite possibly everybody in this room has been accused of lying, right? When we talk about anti-Semitism, when we research about anti-Semitism, when we teach about anti-Semitism, the charge is not that we're just naive, and the charge is not that we are Jews with a chip on our shoulder, but the charge is that we are making it up. We know that we're making it up, and we're doing it for conspiratorial reasons. And the reasons are to silence or to delegitimize criticism of Israel. The question is now posed: are Jews liars? It has many points of origin. The most distant is Luther's On the Jews and Their Lies, 1543. The most proximate, says Julius, Walt and Mearsheimer's The Israel Lobby in US Foreign Policy, 2006 and 7. The contribution of the latter to current anti-Semitic conspiracism would be hard to overestimate. The authors stipulate US support for Israel is strong, yet it is contrary to the US's national interest. What is this force that can pervert the most powerful state on the planet to pursue an interest that is not its own? Why then, they wonder, is this so? The answer is the Israel lobby has the power to bend legislators to its will and thereby subvert the national interest. Among the lobby's weapons is the charge of anti-Semitism. So if you say, oh gosh, look, the Israel lobby has perverted the interest of the United States of America, perverted the United States of America to act against its own interests, then what they say is that that is true. And if we then say, this is a classic piece of anti-Semitic conspiracy fantasy, and it must be, then they say that's how you work. Among the lobbies, the lobby is us, right? All of us who raise the issue of anti-Semitism in this language. Among the lobby's weapons is the charge of anti-Semitism, the great silencer, the Jews are liars, and they lie about being liars. And I think that resonates, my guess is, with everybody in this room. And this is the way I came across it and understood it in my own work. Some of you will remember Ken Livingstone, who was once the mayor of London. Livingstone had a long history of embracing anti-Semitic politics. He was very close to a particular Trotskyist sect in the early 70s. I can tell you the whole long story. But Livingstone, at this moment, was accused of anti-Semitism over something trivial and something nothing to do with Israel, in fact. And he said this: for too long, the accusation of anti-Semitism has been used against anyone who is critical of the policies of the Israeli government, as I have been. So he says, if you're critical of the Israeli government, then this terrible weapon is mobilized against you to delegitimize you, and the terrible weapon is the accusation of anti-Semitism. And it's wielded in bad faith, not a mistake. It's wielded in bad faith, has been used, right? The accusation is that it has been used, it is used. It is not simply an unfortunate error or a fight over discourse. It is a deliberate lie. And this is the mechanism by which Jews get alienated from any social space where they felt that they had the right to feel at home. And we've seen it in 20 years in many, many places. It's my experience in academia. I remember very clearly sitting in Goldsmith sociology, which some of you know was once quite famous and kind of exciting, sitting in the department meetings, right, almost this big, right, and thinking, wow, I am one of these people. I've made it. That's amazing, right? I remember feeling really proud to belong. And then I started making arguments against the proposed academic boycott of Israel, the proposal to exclude Israelis from our campus and our journals and our conferences. And as soon as I started doing that, then I was transformed from one of these, from a sociologist, a Goldsmith sociologist, into a Zionist sociologist, which means a dishonest, lying sociologist, somebody who is kind of clever and uses the discourse and the vocabulary of sociology in order to pervert its true mission, because its true mission is to side with the oppressed, and a Zionist sociologist will pervert the discourse and the discipline into siding with the oppressors, and he will know what he's doing. And of course, being in England, it was done very politely and quietly. And nobody ever really said much, but I just was no longer part of this group, which I had felt proud to be part of. And it hurts. I mean, it really hurts. And again, I imagine that everybody here pretty well has experienced something similar. And since then, I've been watching it, right? People came to me and said, I joined the Labour Party in 2016 because I was really excited about Corbyn and his socialist politics. And I couldn't believe what happened over the next 2 years. And I left in 2018 because it was anti-Semitic. And part of me is sitting there going, you're an idiot, right? 2016, why were you still joining in 2016? And they weren't idiots. They were not idiots. They were just people who had not experienced that yet and who did not understand it yet. And that's a weird thing about contemporary anti-Semitism, which is that if you have not really experienced it and if you have not seen it, you're not that likely to understand it. And it's a bit of a mystery, that one, right? Because if I say to you there used to be a system in South Africa where the law defined certain people as one race and other people as another race, and it discriminated against them, everybody will go, oh my gosh, that's terrible. That's really wrong. Apartheid is bad. I can see that immediately. But if I tell you there is this form of anti-Semitism which alienates Jews by accusing them of dishonesty, most people will go, no, there isn't. It's not. That's not. Most people cannot see it. And that's very frightening. It's very frightening if the people who can see it have a reason to see it because they've experienced it up close, and the people who haven't experienced it can't see it. I'm exaggerating, but I think that's a phenomenon. And that's why so many people allow it to go on, because they don't really see it. Okay, so that's the Livingston formulation. It is a conspiracy fantasy that anyone who raises the issue of anti-Semitism is doing so dishonestly and for ulterior motives. And I think it is completely standard. I think pretty well anyone who raises the issue of anti-Semitism comes up against that. The major critique of IRA is the Livingston formulation. It says IRA is really an instrument for prohibiting criticism of Israel. And you say, well, hang on. In it, it says that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. And they go, haha, that just shows how clever this conspiracy is, right? Read between the lines, because that is its actual function. And you say, well, if somebody is trying to make all criticism of Israel illegitimate, then you need IRA, because IRA prevents you from doing that. It says it's not anti-Semitic. And then they just look at you like you're, too clever by half and you're trying to manipulate. There was an old story in early Christian times that the Jew reasoned with the good Christian, and he gave him reasons to believe in sin, right? The Jew and the devil, because the Jew and the devil became kind of one. They challenged the believer, the good, simple believer. They challenged him with reason and with arguments and with the serpent's tongue. And quite often that's where we end up. If you insist on looking at the evidence and looking at how we understand it and looking at different examples, in the end, people will look at you like, stop it. I know what's going on here, and I don't need to hear your reasoning anymore. So here's a question. Somebody mentioned yesterday, actually, some of these guys, they don't understand how terrible the Israeli government is, right? Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and his political allies. And somebody should really at least say that part of the reason everybody hates Israel is because Israel is, does things that are hateable. And I think that's a really kind of fairly straightforward fallacy, actually. And it's a fallacy because, it might well be true that people in the Israeli government are awful, awful people, and they embrace racist politics, and they are reprehensible in a whole number of ways. Might well be true. But if I look at Israel from far away and then I say, look, they're really terrible and they do terrible things, and then I start describing those terrible things in the language of anti-Semitism, and I start saying how powerful they are and how much they dominate the Western media and the Western imagination and Hollywood, and if I start saying that they're the only ones who get away with genocide, and if I start saying that it's their money and their power that makes it happen, and if I start saying that they are deliberately murdering children when they're not, and if I start saying that they commit genocide when they don't, in fact, when they were the victims of genocide not in 1942 but in 2023, it's the way you understand the world that makes you anti-Semitic, right? If you understand the world through anti-Semitism, if you create an anti-Semitic idea of the world for yourself and you fight for it amongst other people, you're responsible. It doesn't matter how bad this or that Jewish person is. Right? It doesn't matter how bad this or that black person is. It doesn't matter how bad, what a terrible wife this or that woman is. If you universalize it into a racism or into a sexism, that's on you. Do you see what I mean? So the way I put it up here is it's a process of mystification, right? If there was zero connection between what happens in the real world and the anti-Semitic telling of it, it would have no traction, I think. If there was just nothing, if it was just based on zero, it would not have traction. So what happens with all of these isms, with racism and sexism, is that there are actual things that happen in the world, and those actual things get mystified into a worldview. It's a process of mystification, that you explain this and that specific thing that happens in terms of a bigger racist, anti-Semitic, sexist worldview. For example, on the left you have a Jewish capitalist, Roman Abramovich and his horrible football team. Thank you. And on the right, you have the anti-Semitic picture of the Jewish capitalist. Right? It doesn't matter how vile Roman Abramovich was. It doesn't matter how much he was in league with Putin. It doesn't matter how many times he employed Jose Mourinho. He was a person, and he was following his own interest. He was not a person who was part of a Jewish collectivity and for whom every action was part of a conspiracy. You said there are a lot of Jews in Hollywood. Well, maybe there are, maybe there aren't, maybe there were. But the Jews in Hollywood are not there as Jews, right? Steven Spielberg make his movies because he likes them. He likes his movies. They're successful. They're his production. And Spielberg's movies are not the same as, some other Jewish producers' movies, right? So the mystification is partly in seeing every Jew as a tentacle of the whole, where in fact every Jew is just a Jew, right? Just a person. And they are different, they are diverse, they are not one single homogeneous entity, they are individuals. They might, of course, have things in common, they might, of course, talk to each other, they might, of course, agree on some things, but to mystify that into an anti-Semitic worldview is your business, right? That's what the anti-Semite does. So we need to talk about agency. We need to talk about the fact that anti-Semitism just doesn't, it's not just around, right? It's not just in the ether, it's not just in the puddles, it's not just in the culture, but people pick it up and reconfigure it and set it to work for their own reasons, in their own time, in their own interests. And each time that happens, it's different. I'll come back to that in a minute, because I think it's quite interesting to look at the debates about historicism and specificity and agency. I'll come back to that if that was all a blah, blah, blah. On the left, you have a Jewish Bolshevik. On the right, you have Jewish Bolshevism. Right? It's not the same thing. You take Trotsky, you might think he was evil in all kinds of ways, but he is not the anti-Semitic ideology of Jewish Bolshevism. He is just a Jewish bloke and a Bolshevik. The guy on the left is a Zionist. The guy on the right is a Zionist. So we get mystified through a process of mystification from things that are real in the real world. There is a real conflict in the Middle East, and it's a nasty conflict, and it's a conflict fundamentally, one would think, over land, but it's not only over land. There's a real conflict, and people die, and people under the age of 18 die. But to mystify that into child murder in the tradition of the blood libel is on you. You see what I'm saying about agency here? There are pro-Israel lobbying organizations. There are organizations against anti-Semitism. But Mearsheimer and Walt's notion of the Israel lobby with a capital L is something else. It's something with supreme power. It's something with the power to subvert the foreign policy of the most powerful state on the planet. So it's a mystification from actual things that exist in the real world. You might not like AIPAC, you might not like the ZOA, whatever. But to transform all of that and ISGAP and the London Centre into the Israel lobby is to transform a complex reality into an anti-Semitic worldview. Right, now I'm going to get onto that thing that I introduced just now. Like, David Nirenberg's book is really compelling. It's a great book. And he tells this story fundamentally of 3,000 years of anti-Semitism, or he calls it anti-Judaism, doesn't he? Is that his term? And he says this is fundamentally one phenomenon throughout history. And for sure, in some ways it must be, because it keeps repeating the same patterns and the same tropes and comes back again and again, and it just appears to us as a repetition of an ahistorical, timeless. Sometimes it kind of goes under the surface a bit and comes back, under the surface a bit, comes back, but it never really changes. And Hannah Arendt comes along and she says, you need to be careful with this, she says. The reason you need to be careful with this, the reason you need to pay close attention to the differences of different times and different places and different movements and the different culture under in medieval Spain and in Nazi Germany and in post-1979 Iran, different times, different places, different social structures, different languages, different traditions. You need to pay close attention to the differences. Why? Well, partly because they are obviously just different in key and important ways, but also I think because of agency, because if it's just one huge sea monster that lurks, who's responsible for that? Where did it come from? And the people who are just kind of infused with anti-Semitism, what is their responsibility? I mean, perhaps it's a bit like Bauman and the Holocaust, like Bauman kind of says, well, the Holocaust is just a function of modernity. And he says, but there were some people who were really so strong that they were able to step outside of what Weber called the iron cage of modernity, and they were able to act morally. Bauman makes this distinction between rationality and moral behavior. So normal people just get kind of carried away into this, modern cage of determinism, of structure. But there are some very special human beings who are able to act morally. So that's a way of letting nearly everyone off the hook. To say if you're not extraordinary, then you will just be part of the social structure into which you're born and which directs you. I don't like that, actually, because I think human agency is very important. And actually, if you ask me about sociology, I amaze myself sometimes that I'm still loyal to sociology, actually, to the sociology that I was taught, that I was brought up in by Robert Fine and Gillian Rose, and by the classics, by Durkheim and Weber. I think there's something hugely valuable in sociology. And in fact, I think that my analysis, my account of contemporary anti-Semitism owes a lot to sociology. Sociology was created quite a lot by Jews, by people like Emil Durkheim, and if you count Marx, the kind of an attempt to come up with an objective account of how social life works. Why is that so important? It's important because it undercuts conspiracy fantasy. If you can come up with a theory of how it works, if you can explain it, then you don't need some evil Jew lurking behind the scenes directing everything. So sociology itself is quite important. Now I've forgotten how I got to sociology in that long ramble. Anyway, I'll probably come back to it. One of the ways of looking at it then is that it's not a timeless, ahistorical single phenomenon. But so then how do we explain the similarities of each new wave of anti-Semitism? Why are they so similar? And I think it's back to what I said earlier on. It's something about the evolution of tropes and images and feelings that explain evil in the world and give it a Jewish face. Give it a face that we can all relate to. Remember 1984? Remember 2 Minutes Hate? They put up on the screen the Jewish face, and they called him Emmanuel Goldstein, and he was Big Brother's nemesis. Why did they need this Jewish face to hate? Because Big Brother promised utopia and couldn't deliver. So he needed an explanation for this, right? He needed that evil still lurks in the world, and that evil has a Jewish face. And Orwell, for all his failings, understood the kind of deep connection between totalitarianism and anti-Semitism. So maybe people, they pick up the fragments that already exist and that are emotionally virulent, right? The Jewish face, the claws, the horns, the conspiracy, the control, the drinking of the blood, the murdering of the children. These fragments lie around in the debris of sort of long defeated and forgotten anti-Semitic movements. And what do people do? They pick them up again and they say, oh, this looks like it'll work for something. This will get people going. This will help people to understand what I want them to understand. And the idea of agency, the idea that people who embrace anti-Semitism are responsible for their anti-Semitism, for the mystifications that they use to understand the world is very important, I think. And it's a very difficult idea, right? Because it's an anti-Semitism that is denied. You know, take Jeremy Corbyn. There was a huge kind of backwards and forwards. Is Jeremy Corbyn really an anti-Semite? And what does that question even mean? You reply and you say, well, Corbyn embraced anti-Semitic politics. He embraced and he legitimized and he pushed anti-Semitic ways of thinking in the world, and you can prove it with, you know, countless examples of him doing that. Okay, he embraced anti-Semitism, he pushed it, and then people say, yeah, but was he actually an anti-Semite? And you go, well, what is an anti-Semite other than somebody who embraces anti-Semitic politics and pushes for it and legitimizes it and fights for it? What are you saying? What are you asking me? And what you're asking me actually is this idea that anti-Semitism is something in the heads of bad people, bad anti-Semitic people. If you're really an anti-Semite, then you're bad and you hate Jews and you know it and you stomp around like doing the silly goose step. So what do you think then Corbyn is? If he's not that guy, what is he? So the question is, how do we understand agency if we take seriously the possibility that Jeremy Corbyn honestly believes he's not an anti-Semite? And I think the evidence is overwhelming. I think Jeremy Corbyn does not believe he's an anti-Semite. He's not pretending, he's not lying, he's not part of some kind of global movement that is trying to push anti-Semitism. So how do we understand that? How do we understand that some of the key actors don't know it? And worse than that, they don't know it and they think they are the real opponents of anti-Semitism. They think they're the good guys. It's very important. If you want to understand today's anti-Semitism, you have to understand that the people who embrace it and push it and defend it think that they are the good guys. So how do we then understand this idea of agency? Who's responsible? And it seems to me that sometimes you are an agent and sometimes you are responsible morally and legally, even if you don't know what you're doing. And then, you know, everybody tells you. It's not like they didn't tell you. They tell you and then you counter-accuse them of lying and them of being the evil one. Anyway, I haven't got all the answers to that question about agency, but it's a very important question, I think. And the question of agency is also about the differences between anti-Semitism in different countries, right? It is one movement, for sure, globally, but everybody's using anti-Semitism for slightly different things, for the things that they're concerned about, right? So in America, you use anti-Semitism to describe who you are, right? It's not about Israel, it's not about Jews, it's about describing who you are. And of course, there is a long Christian tradition of doing this, right? Of describing your own goodness and your own Christianity in relation to the Jews. I mean, it's a theological weirdness, isn't it? That Jewish theology doesn't have any interest in Christianity at all, but Christian theology is often completely obsessed about Jews and about what they call the Old Testament. It's just a kind of inbuilt imbalance, really. So Christianity, Christian society is so often tempted to describe who it is in relation to Jewish evil, Jewishness. And if you pick up a kind of passion play from the Middle East and you use it in America to make sense of your own issues about race and whiteness and blackness, what are you doing? Or in Britain, if you pick up a passion play that we all know, it's like Greek legends, right? When Freud wants to talk about Oedipus, he can draw on the Greek myths because Freud knows that every educated person knows the story of Oedipus. It's not like that anymore, but we can Google it, right? We can Google Oedipus and find out what Freud needed these stories so that we could all discuss the issue. And the Israel-Palestine story and the Jews and their role in it becomes a kind of passion play, a kind of legend by which we all tell you who we are. In Ireland, it's kind of fascinating. Oh, I haven't got Ireland up there. Ireland's, oh, I have at the bottom. It's kind of fascinating because in Ireland, the loyalists tend to embrace Israel. They wave the Israeli flag and they say, we hate terrorism and we hate terrorists. And then the Republicans wave the Palestinian flag and say, we embrace the fight against colonialism and racism and imperialism. And they're not talking about the Middle East, right? When an Israeli player who plays for Celtic Football Club in Glasgow, which is like a largely Catholic-orientated and Ireland-orientated football club, when the Israeli player is driven out after 7th of October, it's nothing to do with Israel, it's nothing to do with this poor player, and it's everything to do with people in Glasgow. Firstly, people in Glasgow who think that they're Irish, because they're not, and they haven't been for generations, but they think they are. And secondly, with that Irishness being articulated along the lines of this passion play from the Middle East that is kind of borrowed. What's the word? Cultural appropriation. I mean, that's a genuine cultural appropriation. And it does nothing for the Palestinians, obviously. I don't need to say that, right? That when you appropriate the story and the real suffering, actually, of Palestinians, when you appropriate it and bring it to Tehran and you make it into something to do with Khomeini, does not help the Palestinians. There was a fantastic Saudi film. Did anyone ever see that film called Wajda? Wajda? Yeah. It was about I could tell you the whole. It was about a girl who wanted to ride a bike, and it was difficult in Saudi Arabia. She couldn't get a bike. Nobody would let her ride a bike, and she saw a bike. She wanted to buy it, and she didn't have the money. And then she entered a competition that if you learn the Quran or learn a big section of the Quran, and you win a competition, then you get money. And she wanted the money to buy her bike, and she worked really hard, and she learned the Quran. But they knew what she was up to, right? So she won the competition because she was the best. And they put her on the stage and everybody applauded and said how brilliant she is. And then they said, the money is here and we're sure that you will be very happy if we donate the money to your brothers and sisters who are suffering in Palestine. And she's going, but what about my bike? This does nothing actually for anybody, really. I want to say something about left anti-Semitism and anti-hegemonic anti-Semitism, and just really straightforwardly to say that it's a real thing. Like there are people who will, Badiou, the French Maoist philosopher, believe it or not, who is still listened to, says it's an oxymoron. You cannot be left-wing and anti-Semitic because if you're anti-Semitic, then by definition you're not left-wing. And if you're left-wing, then by definition you're not anti-Semitic. So it's impossible. It's literally unthinkable for someone on the left to be anti-Semitic. And that means if somebody is anti-Semitic, they're not part of our movement. And if somebody is part of our movement, they can't be anti-Semitic. And Moishe Postone, in this quote, explains why there is actually a tradition of left anti-Semitism, and it is this. He says anti-Semitism can appear to be anti-hegemonic. It's interesting because a lot of left accounts of racism and anti-Semitism portray them as elite phenomena, right? Racism is a kind of plot by the bourgeoisie to divide the working class and to prevent it from gaining consciousness by turning people against each other. It's an elite phenomenon kind of put into the working class. But Moishe says actually anti-Semitism is in some sense authentically anti-hegemonic. It's anti-elite, as is a lot of populism, at least in its rhetoric, as a fetishized form of oppositional consciousness. Yeah. What is the definition of racism?
Yeah, you just said that it was about
So a kind of standard Marxist account of race is one which says that race is fundamentally a creation of the bourgeoisie. It's fundamentally a creation of bourgeois society, and it is allowed and encouraged in the hope of dividing the working class. We certainly can look at scholars of race and racism, for sure, but I'm saying that there is this tradition of Marxist understanding which posits racism to be an elite phenomenon, something which is put into society from the top, from the people with power. And I think actually that most contemporary theories of race and racism would also have that view, that it is fundamentally, racism is fundamentally a phenomenon that is put into society by the powerful, and that the powerless people and the oppressed people have no interest in it at all. I think that is probably somewhere where most contemporary theories of race draw on that tradition of Marxist understanding, I think. And Moish says that actually anti-Semitism can work as a fetishized form of oppositional consciousness, meaning that whereas it is kind of, according to Marxism, it is reasonable for working class people to understand their own unity and to understand their own opposition to the elites, the ruling class. Moish says that in fact anti-Semitism can be a kind of skewed, mistaken form of opposition to oppression. It is particularly dangerous because it appears to be the expression of a movement of the little people against an intangible global form of domination. And I think it's quite important to remember that there is this spirit of anti-Semitism, which is actually something that has been embraced by people on the left since August Bebel talked about the socialism of fools, and actually since well before that. Marx himself was involved in, I mean, we can talk about Marx and probably people would disagree, but Marx was very clear about the democratic state being a state that includes Jews and that it's unconditional. Doesn't matter what the Jew does, the state must emancipate Jewish people. Deborah Lipstadt puts it in her own way. Racism. So we hear this quite a lot, right, about punching down and punching up. And it's a bit, you kind of think, well, hang on, like, stop punching me thinking you're punching up. And that's the very point, I think, is that racism is a fantasy of punching down, right? It's not actually punching. Sorry, racism is punching up, isn't it? Have I got it the wrong way around? Racism. Anyway, you get the point. The point is that these are kind of fantasy ideas of punching, which are really divorced from what is actually going on. And anti-Semitism is a fantasy of punching up, punching the oppressors, punching the bad people. But it is exactly that. It's a fantasy. What's the time? How am I doing?
5 more minutes.
Oh, fuck. Okay, all right.
You want more? 10
No. I'm going to skip over a few things.
Okay. 10 minutes.
I wanted to make more time for questions, which I will try to do right now. Lots of interesting things that I'm skipping over. Let me just say a little bit about our project. The London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism is an attempt to institutionalise academic work against anti-Semitism, academic work about anti-Semitism, and academic work that engages with anti-Semitic academic production and practice. And the idea is that we are excluded to a significant extent from the community of scholarship, which is the university. Universities are communities of scholarship, and we are excluded generally by the mechanism which I discussed earlier on. We are excluded by people looking at our work and saying, haha, I know what that is. That is done in bad faith in order to delegitimize work that is critical of Israel. So what we are trying to do is to reconstruct and recreate the infrastructure of scholarship and the community of scholarship. The infrastructure being publishing, books, journals, seminars, conferences, and community. Because you cannot do scholarship by yourself, right? It can't be done as an individual. Scholarship is a kind of communal enterprise. And that's one of the effects of the exclusion of people who take anti-Semitism seriously. You can find our website at londonantisemitism.com. And please, all of you get out your phones and see if you can download the QR code, because we have put out a call for papers for a big conference next at the end of March and the beginning of April. And very excited about that. People might remember that we had a conference in 2022. This one is going to be bigger and better, partly because we're better organised and partly because we're working in partnership with the Compare Centre at Haifa University, and partly also miserably because anti-Semitism has had a big boost in its arm and it is stronger, and therefore there are more and more people around the edges who are taking the study of anti-Semitism seriously. So please.
Download the link and put it into the WhatsApp group for everybody.
I did do last night, actually. If people scroll up, I can do it again. Oh,
Yeah, I did
brilliant,
it right now.
brilliant. It's also easy to find if you go to the website. Actually, if you go to londonantisemitism.com, and you scroll down, you'll find it there also. And there will be more details and specifics coming out. But please write an abstract and write panel proposals and come to London in the spring. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much, David, as always. So we have time. We have over 30 minutes for Q&A. I'll take it.
Thank you very much, David, for your presentation. Excellent as always. I always enjoy your talks. I just wanted to add to your mention about Marsheimer, the author of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, just to allow everybody to understand what kind of character this person is. In one of the previous lectures, somebody mentioned that anti-Semitism doesn't end with Jews. And Marsheimer is an excellent example because he not only attacks Israel, he also attacks Ukraine. And when Putin made his invasion to Ukraine, which by the way displaced about 100,000 Jews, Marsheimer was one of the leading scholars to attack the West and to say that Putin was forced by the U.S. foreign policy to invade Ukraine. Poor Putin had nothing could have done nothing else. He just had to invade Ukraine because Russia was so much threatened. So just understand the mindset of this person whose works, despite coming from the left, are actually very popular among the neo-Nazis. So just I wanted to add this. Thank you.
Good point.
Hi. So I think when we talk about agency, one follow-up question needs to be intent, and I think intent is very important. And while some have like a nefarious intent and they clearly want to be anti-Semitic, I think some on all levels it comes from ignorance, right? They really don't think they're being anti-Semitic and they're very ignorant. And I mean, we see that even on our college campuses. Probably there's a lot of ignorance. And while the academic circles and it's very, very important, and I'm not at all discrediting it, the ignorance starts at a very young age. And so I'm just curious on your thoughts about how we can deal with that and access that. I mean, just one example that I'm involved with is Holocaust education, right? We're getting to the classrooms in America. A lot of states have mandated it, but it's completely divorced from anti-Semitism. And almost all the classrooms are not allowed to teach about anti-Semitism. So we have a buildup of teaching the Holocaust with ignorance that it's even connected to anti-Semitism. So I'm just curious on your thoughts of that challenge for the younger.
So you respond?
Okay. Zbigniew, yes, spot on, absolutely right. The only thing I would add, and I agree with everything you said, Ukraine. So remember first that the notion that Israel is an inherently illegitimate, pro-imperialist, Nazi state. Remember where it comes from, right? Isabella at the back will tell you sometime this week it comes from the Soviet Union, and she will explain how, right? The notion of Israel is uniquely imperialist, Nazi, and inauthentic. It's not a real nation. It's an entity. So what does Moscow say about Ukraine? Moscow says that Ukraine is Nazi, it is inauthentic, it is an imperialist construction, and it is there to do down the peoples who live around it. And remember that one of the ways of telling the story about Israel as being inauthentic is to say that the white Jews, so-called white Jews who come from Europe, are not really Jews at all. They never came from the Middle East. They are in fact descended from a tribe in Central Europe called the Khazars, and they are completely settler colonists in the Middle East. And remember that Zelensky himself, the president of this inauthentic Nazi pro-imperialist entity, is also a Zionist. And remember also that the Khazars actually come from Ukraine. Huh? So the two inauthentic states are in fact racially identical. I mean, this kind of lunacy is, I mean, it's kind of beautiful in its lunacy, but it's quite scary.
By the way, the word Khazar is an excellent keyword for tracing Russian propaganda.
Yes.
Because usually it's typically Russians who are using the word Khazar and Khazar theory. Even Palestinians have it from Russia.
Yeah. What's your name? Sorry.
As opposed to
My name is
Monique, you made two very, very good points, I think, or at least two that I noticed. One is about intent. And in legal discussion and in discussions about whether something is anti-Semitic, I think it's very important to understand that you do not need to prove intent, right? This is completely normal, and everyone in the sociology or the academic study of race and racism and sexism understands this very well. Judith Butler teaches us that we are all immersed in structures of power, and to embrace sexist ways of thinking, we do not need to have an intent to be bigoted and sexist, right? It's normal. Everybody knows this. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, people think differently. Judith Butler herself thinks differently. And you say to Judith Butler, hang on, you keep saying anti-Semitic things. Are you anti-Semitic? And she says, oh, goodness me, no. I look into my own head and I find myself innocent because I have access to my own head in this case, which I don't have with all those bad and horrible racists and sexists out there. I have access to my own head and I can tell you that I'm good and I do not hate Jews and I have no intent and therefore I'm not anti-Semitic. So this notion that racism is not just badness, right? It is a structure of power that kind of runs far and wide across society. That notion is just lost. Woof, it's gone with anti-Semitism, and then people forget that anti-Semitism is an external and objective structure of power, and they start thinking, well, it's just about, being like a Nazi. So a real kind of, I mean, I'm not big on hypocrisy, but it's a real hypocrisy and a real forgetting of the lessons that the left has taught us, and sometimes, I think, with reason. But it is just kind of forgotten and put down. So always, if you raise the issue of anti-Semitism, I think pretty well always, the response will come in the form of a discussion about intention. No, Corbyn is not anti-Semitic because he has no intent. And we know that that is the wrong way to think about an objective and external social phenomenon. So I completely agree with you. And what you say about Holocaust education, I think, is also really important. Quite often people are saying to me nowadays, recently, they're saying, we should stop doing Holocaust education. We ploughed all this money into Holocaust education. It was a waste of money. All the money went down the drain, and all we got was people saying, that the Israelis are Nazis. And not completely without reason, right? But the problem is what kind of Holocaust education you do. And there are two aspects to Holocaust education. For sure, the Holocaust is a phenomenon that resonates throughout humanity. When humanity lives in a world where the Holocaust has happened, it's important for everybody. So there is a sense in which the Holocaust is a universal phenomenon. But there's also a sense in which the Holocaust is a specific phenomenon about Jews and about anti-Semitism. And if you teach the Holocaust without both of those aspects, then you're not really doing it properly. And the problem is that to teach it as an empty, abstract universal, this is what happens when people are mean to each other. This is what happens when racism catches on. The problem is that you then don't understand that there's something specific about anti-Semitism and that the Holocaust is a specific set of events in Jewish history. And so we've seen some of the awful results that can happen if you, and it's easy, right? If you teach, about the Holocaust in an inner city school in Berlin, and you have lots of Turkish kids going, what's this got to do with me? And what about Gaza? Like, I suspect any of us would find that hard to teach that class. And we know more than your average high school teacher. It's hard. And so it's easy and it's tempting to strip all the difficult stuff and to teach the Holocaust as an abstract universal. So if that's what you're saying, I agree with you completely, or if I'm kind of elaborating with my view, then that's what I think.
So please signal me, and I'm going to write down your names to try and get as many of you in. So I see Charlotte and Amy. I've got two of your questions, and then David can respond.
I was wondering, sort of reflecting on what you're saying, David, about sort of understanding whether you're engaging with anti-Semitism. Does it not really come down to redefining what racism is and moving away from what's overwhelming the definition, I think more informed by critical race theory, this idea that in order to suffer racism you have to come from an oppressed history according to whatever the current understanding of history is. If racism was understood to be in the eyes of the person experiencing it and was an experience of oppression according to their identifiable characteristics that have been grouped into and designated as a race, then you would be able to have anti-Semitism understood as racism by the common man. And at the moment, racism is not understood in that way, and therefore anti-Semitism kind of gets ruled out of being able to be a racism. So I was wondering if you thought actually tackling racism, its definition and how it's understood could be important. And the other thing that I had a question about, I don't know if this is going to be a little bit controversial, but the intent question. So I get called an Islamophobe for my work being on Islamist extremism predominantly. So I focus disproportionately on Islamist extremism, and I focus disproportionately on Islamic states because it's my area of research and expertise. Does the same thing happen to those whose area and expertise might be the experience of Palestinians in the West Bank or something like this? If they are then focusing on that, doesn't that then satisfy IRA, and doesn't intent then become important? Because if they are an academic and that's their research area, and they therefore don't talk about other areas of the world or other discriminations because it's their area of research, then what?
You want to respond, or Amy?
Yeah, can do. So two parts to that question, I think. Racism. So if we focus on racism as a subjective experience, I think you're saying then, rather than as a sort of objective structure of power, then we can understand anti-Semitism more easily as a racism. So I don't know about that. I think that there is a lot gained. There is something significant gained by understanding racism as more than just a subjective feeling of persecution. because I think racism exists out there in the world, and it's subjective, and it is structural. It's also to do with agency. That's what I wanted to say earlier on about sociology, about structure and agency, actually, and maybe I'll find a moment to come back to that. I think we need both. I think we need to understand racism as an external, objective, social structure of power, and also as something in which people have agency and experience. And I think the question about whether that would make it easier for people to understand anti-Semitism as a racism is an interesting question. And there are all positions represented within scholars and activists against anti-Semitism. So some people will say that it's really important that we get anti-Semitism recognized as a form of racism, because in that way we get it recognized as being as important as racism. Everybody knows racism is the most important thing in the world, and anti-Semitism should be recognized as a racism and therefore understood to be important. And other people say kind of the opposite, that anti-Semitism is not just an ordinary racism, but anti-Semitism has specific features which make it different. And people generally talk about conspiracy fantasy and then about the idea that the Jews are a kind of block universally between us and utopia. So I don't really want to get into that. I think, of course, I mean, obviously, like when you ask a question about is something like something else, like everything in the world is like everything else in the world, and everything in the world is different from everything else in the world. So the question becomes, what is at stake? What are we really asking when we say anti-Semitism is racism, or when we say anti-Semitism is specific? And I think there are two reasonable questions, and we can ask them both, really. And I'm sure there are people in this room with very clear views, but anti-Semitism scholars are kind of divided on that, I think. And then, just to finish, there are also people who minimize anti-Semitism using both frameworks, right? So Corbyn always says, well, yeah, anti-Semitism is bad, but all racism is bad, and the subtext is like, Jews, get back in line, right? This is only racism, and fuck it, we all suffer from racism, and stop making yourself so special. And then on the other hand, the people who say, well, yeah, anti-Semitism is sometimes bad, but it is not a structural phenomenon across, the whole of modern society, and therefore it's not as serious as racism. So there's four quadrants of a Cartesian thing.
Amy, thank you. Amy.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for your talk, and I know that you shortened it a good bit. My question for you is, how should some of us be understanding your new Prime Minister? Has the Labour Party really transformed itself? Is this Corbyn-like, or is this the savior of the left because he is somebody of Jewish heritage and he has Shabbat? How is it that you think, and I know it's early days, I'm just wondering, because we have here, what are your thoughts on the new leadership, the new government?
So I remember speaking to some of my friends who were the kind of politicos, the political operatives, even like I don't remember how many years ago, 2-3 years ago already, and they were just really pleased with themselves, and they said, we have cleaned out the Labour Party, we won. And I would be going, but this and but that, and they'd be going, shut up, we won, it's brilliant. And from their point of view, they were not wrong, right? They did clean out the structures of the Labour Party. They got rid of the people who work in the Labour Party structure who embrace anti-Semitic politics. They got rid of the faction that embraces anti-Semitism. Starmer is a factional enemy of Corbyn and the Corbynites, and you can see that, for example, in the way that he's made some very quick kind of expulsions. He's expelled Corbyn from the Labour Party. Nobody would have ever thought that was possible, actually. And he's made other moves very quickly. So, in general, I think Starmer's quite good in general. I think that, I'm not going to go on about the Tory governments for the last 10 years, but they have been focused and obsessed by stories to do with their own political fantasies, and they forgot to govern, right? While they were doing Brexit and worrying about small boats crossing the channel and all of the things that they were trying to worry about, they forgot to make sure that the hospitals were running and the schools were running, and people voted Labour because they became convinced, and I think rightly so, that if they need an ambulance, then they might have to wait 4 hours for an ambulance, and that's it, right? That's why they voted Labour. So 2 things have happened in the last couple of weeks that are worrying. One of them is that Labour gave money to UNRWA, and I don't think that was the right thing to do. I think it's actually quite a difficult choice, actually, because I think, there is real, genuine hardship in Gaza, and I think the structure that exists Hamas is still in power in Gaza, right? So to feed people in Gaza, you have to deal with Hamas being in power. So I think there are arguments for doing it. I don't agree with them. I also think that it's an argument that we never accepted in any other battle against totalitarianism. I said this to the same guy actually, one of the politicos. I said, we never accepted that when you're fighting totalitarians, you should make sure that they have food and fuel. And he said, no, that's not true. He said, when the Allies were moving across Europe in the Second World War, they were dropping supplies and food for starving populations. I don't know if that's true, but that's what he said to me. So I don't agree with that, and I think it's a possible position. It's one that I don't agree with. And the other thing they've done is I've missed slightly the story, actually. Has Netanyahu actually been indicted by the court? Not yet, or not? Okay. Okay.
And actually today, in the morning, they said that in a couple of days, he's going to hinder selling.
Oh, the UK is?
Yes.
Okay. So the point about Britain is that Britain had said Netanyahu is safe to be in Britain and he will not be arrested and handed over to the court in The Hague. And the new government has kind of prevaricated on that in a way that I think is wrong. And I think the charge of genocide against Israel is a reversal and a projection and an inversion, and is therefore part of an anti-Semitic narrative, and I think we should have nothing to do with it. So, look, it's reasonable to argue politics again, and I think it's unreasonable to say that these 2 things mean that the British government has suddenly become an anti-Semitic enemy. We'll see. Sorry, that was one other. Yes. So the problem for the Labour Party is interesting. That it's true that the structure of the party had been cleaned out, but the Labour Party still sits on a big, broad swathe of liberal and left opinion, and that anti-Semitism is well represented amongst the people who look to join the party and who support it and who vote for it. That's a problem. The same guy said to me, no, they're not letting them join anymore, which I think he probably knows what he's talking about. So it's interesting, and anti-Semitism has not gone away. And by the same token, the populism that is better represented in that section of society, and the anti-Semitism that comes with it, which wasn't there 20 or 30 years ago, is also mirrored by a populism and a conspiracy fantasy and an openness to racism on the other side of politics too. So I think there's more polarization and more populism, and it's all more worrying. But oddly, right now, this minute, Britain has the most rational government anywhere, really. If you think that, anyway, France is in danger and Germany is in danger and America is in danger of being taken over by the populists.
Thanks. Excuse me. I have your today. Wendy and then
Sure. I just want to add something to this point, if possible.
Okay, very quickly, please.
Okay, I just attended the Jewish Labor Movement party, and related to your question.
The party, the celebration.
I just talked with few MPs there, and I have few more insights that it would be interesting related to this question.
I want to go back to your point cetera, et cetera. And so what happens then is who is responsible and how you term them. And I think my issue, and I wanted to ask your opinion on this, is when we say somebody is good or bad, or a racist, or an anti-Semite, or a misogynist, or something else, you're labeling the person and not their acts. And if they hear that, and if they're not extreme, they don't see it as themselves. And if it prevents anybody who's not extreme from looking inwards to seeing where they may have conceptions that are not, that harbor some of these issues. And so I'm wondering if there's any room for like a shift in how we talk about things, to start labeling people instead of labeling their actions. Because if you hear it and you don't think you are, you're never going to look inwards to see if there's anything worth looking at.
I mean, that's a kind of tactical question, really. Like, if we think somebody is an anti-Semite, should we stop saying that they're an anti-Semite so that they will be more likely to listen to what we have to say?
Same thing with racism.
Yeah. I mean, it's not unreasonable, but it's a bit miserable, right? Yeah, we should be tactical. I mean, we noticed this fighting the boycott, right? That when we were fighting the academic boycott, you cannot understand the academic boycott campaign without understanding that it sits in the tradition of anti-Semitism, that it is an anti-Semitic movement. But at the same time, you cannot win votes against it if you say this is all about you being anti-Semitic, right? And that's a problem because because sometimes it's harder to win people over when you actually tell the truth about what's going on.
When you insult them, because then they can't hear it. You have to speak, this is communications. I come from a communications background, and I think you need to speak to people in a way they can hear it. Otherwise, nothing can change.
I mean, if somebody's an anti-Semite, it's not that insulting to say that they're an anti-Semite, but I take your point, and I wish I was better at that kind of communication than I am. But my job is always, I think, to kind of look at what's going on and then to hand it over to you and to the politicians and to the people who know how to shift public opinion and say, fix it.
Thank you, David, for this important view on and thank you, Charles, for what
Can you speak louder?
No, we cannot hear you.
Abdurrahim, maybe stand up.
Okay.
Merci.
So thank you, David, for this important view about entrepreneurship. Thank you, Charles, for inviting me to be part of this important and significant seminar, to be a part of these discussions. Already, David talked about contemporary antisemitism and the forms of antisemitism. I really don't know about antisemitism or new forms of antisemitism inside society, but the violence of similar groups and other, we need to think about this. And we found that it is like a game of concepts. I can refer you to a concept of al-Jahiliyyah, new al-Jahiliyyah, which is established by Muhammad Qutb, the brother of Seth Qutb, and what our Muslim Brotherhood, Eurasians and the Tamers. This new Jahiliyyah, or modern Jahiliyyah, is like a reference to al-Jahl, in Arabic al-Jahl, which means ignorance or al-kufr, which means also an infidelity. Indeed, al-Jahiliyyah is always Islam concept, which means the distinction between two time periods. The pre-Islamic period, which characterized by darkness, ignorance, and disbelief, and then the Islamic period, which signifies light, faith, and liberation. The use of this concept by Muslim Brotherhood theorists is not, in essence, it is used in a reversed manner, which means that the previous period represents for them light and faith. It is seen as the golden era of the Islamic Caliphate or Islamic period. In contrast, the current period, the actual period, is viewed as the new al-Jahiliyyah, characterized by darkness and departure from God and the dominance of God. Enemies, Jews also are enemies of God in the ideology, prophetic texts of Dawah, invitation to Islam, and Hijrah, for the immigration, and Jihad. And this is the ideology is further reinforced by eschatological narratives, which depict an apocalyptic scenario where Muslims will fight Jews who will hide behind trees and will take out the Muslims together. Such views contribute to attend Jews and hostile attitude towards Jews, perpetuating anti-Semitic sentiments and actions. Thank you.
That's all really interesting, as far as I followed it. I think, and it also reminds me, I didn't come back to Charlotte also about Islamophobia. I think there are people doing really interesting work on Islamic Muslim theology. I wouldn't dream of intervening into theological discussions of any kind because I'm not educated in them and I'm not part of the belief system. What I can say as a sociologist, and what the sociologists of Islamist politics have said, is, for example, there is a diversity of Muslim traditions in different places and at different times. There is a diversity of politics, and there is a diversity of understandings over issues like anti-Semitism. So when people say this is the single authentic Islamic view, as a sociologist I can say, well, it has not always been the Islamic view, and it is not the only Islamic view, and the rest of it. So as a sociologist, I think I would go in on the issue of authenticity, actually. And I will certainly leave theologists to do what is important work in saying what is, in their view, good and bad Islam. And on the question of Islamophobia, very quickly, really, is when you work on Islamophobia, when you work on Islamism and Islamist politics, at the very least, you do so carefully. You do so in the understanding, in the knowledge that it can be taken, it can be used and brought, and some of the material that you bring to light can be woven by the process of mystification into an Islamophobic worldview. And we see that happening in front of our eyes, and we need to be careful to avoid it. There's a lot more to say on that. I want to quickly mention the books that I'm flogging here, because that's what I'm doing. I'm very proud of our series, and I will be selling these books after the next session downstairs during the tea break. Our first book was by Matthias Kunzel, and it looks at the legacy from Nazism into Qutb and the other Islamist movements. So we know a lot about the legacy from 20th century Stalinist totalitarianism into contemporary anti-Semitism, but Kunzel also traces the legacy of Nazism also, which I think is very interesting. Our second book was a book by Jeff Hirsh, who you should have heard of, and Jeff has just retired at the University of Maryland, and Jeff kind of put together lots of things he had written over the years about anti-Semitism and sometimes had been lost in obscure journals, and he brought them together and he repackaged them and gave them a new framework, and very proud to publish that. And then there are two books that we published that contain lots of different authors, one of which is Alan Johnson's Fathom book. People should know about Fathom, and if they don't, they should find it. It is an online journal and is very useful and very brilliant. And there's some new stuff in there too. This was my rebirth of anti-Semitism in the 21st century, and there are contributions from 11 scholars who were with us in the early days in 2005 and fighting against the boycott, and who are looking back at the first quarter of the century and trying to understand the anti-Semitism that we saw. And finally, this is something I'm very, very proud of. It is not yet August, but we have already published an academic work of intellectual responses to the 7th of October, very fresh, sometimes emotional, sometimes not entirely mature and thought through, but important responses to 7th of October. It's in 3 volumes because we were given a short, quick format by Routledge, and we said, please can we have some more words? And they said, no, but you can do 2. And we ended up with 3. And I'll be selling these books at a discount price after the next session.
Cool. All right. So thanks. Important work. We have 2 more minutes. So Louis, quick question if we have time for a minute.
Sure. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to zero in on.
We really have to end in 2 minutes.
Okay. Zero in on a very specific one of your panels where you talked about describing who you are through anti-Semitism and how the manifestation of it differs from different countries. I'm already noticing here that obviously America has a different view than Britain, France again different. Are we talking about just an almost infinite number of localized anti-Semitisms? Because I'm from Berkeley, California. It's different than it is in other parts of the country. And what can we learn by looking at sort of localized anti-Semitisms and then learning from each other about similarities or differences?
Yeah. Again, everything in the world is unique, and everything in the world is like everything else. And anti-Semitism has huge commonalities in Berkeley and in London and in Tehran and in Chile and in Argentina. And the elements of discourse float around very quickly online and in the intellectual discussions, political discussions. But they are different also. And it doesn't do us any harm to look at the differences and see what is significant about the differences, even if we think that they come together in a kind of global and threatening mass, I think.
Cool. So on that note, there's much to discuss. David, thank you very much for your assessment. So everybody, there'll be tea on the landing here. You're welcome to go outside with your tea and get some fresh air and sunshine.